My guest today has had the kind of commercial success that most writers can only dream of. Her first book of poems sold over 2.5 million globally and still counting. Her second book of poems quickly catapulted to the bestseller list as well. She's somebody who was younger than 4 years old when she and her family moved from Punjab to Canada. Her identity as a brown woman in some ways is intrinsic to what she writes and how she struck a chord among millions of women, not all of them brown, many of them white. It is my pleasure to welcome Rupi Kaur to this interview. Welcome not just to our conversation, but also to India, which was home for you and your family till you were about, what, 3.5 years old?
Yes, till I was 3.5.
You're Punjabi, my clan.
Yeah.
Do you have any memories of India, or do you think you were too young? Is there any sort of memory that seeped into your subconscious that today, when you look back, you think, hey, I kind of remember that. I don't know if it's real or a dream.
There are some.
So share some.
So there's one memory in particular, and I don't even know if it's real. You know, when people tell you the same story over and over again, you would just remember images.
The oral history of grandmothers and mothers and aunties.
So I remember always riding on the back of probably in the front of my grandfather's motorcycle with him. This is my mom's father, and also when me and my mom were leaving to the airport and parting with my grandfather, and him and I not letting go of each other, and my mom basically pulling me away from him, and then me crying the entire flight all the way to Canada.
And you've come back how often since then?
So this is my third time. Yeah, so the first time I came back, it was 10 years afterwards, and then I waited another 10 years to come back.
So your second book of poems is much more political, as has been pointed out to you repeatedly. And there is this lovely poem, one of my favorites, on being an immigrant. And you talk about how in some ways we're all displaced. It just depends on the degree of displacement, and I think it ends with some of us just leave countries, and it traces the journey of, from the womb to the outside world, maybe sometimes from city to city, and then, the bit about some of us leave countries. That's from the part of the world you come from. Being an immigrant, being a refugee today is one of the most political issues. And it's interesting, I think I read somewhere that you said obviously poems about love and heartbreak kind of do better, but you couldn't be bothered with that when there's so much else going on that's occupying your mind and maybe your rage. So speak a little bit about your own evolution from being a chronicler of love and loneliness to becoming a much more political voice today.
It's funny because actually when I first started to write, I was writing about a lot of domestic violence issues and sexual violence that I felt the women around me in my community in the Toronto area were facing. And so to start off writing about those things kind of made me feel...
In a community where it's taboo to, especially when it's within the circle of trust, sometimes within the extended family or your own family.
And so then it was very difficult because I think the community or the people at the time that were around me, they were like, but what are you doing? Are you just somebody who, this is all you write about, it's all you talk about? And at the time, that's what I was very passionate about, and I still am. And then I never thought I could write a love poem to save my life, and then suddenly I was doing it. And then there was a moment where one of my friends came up to me, maybe you want to focus on what readers really interact with and she pulled up her phone and she's like, online, they're interacting with the heartbreak so much and the love so much, and maybe focus on that. And I tried that for a couple of weeks, and I just felt something inside of me was just telling me this is wrong. And then I had to make a decision, and the decision was that if I'm not going to write about those difficult issues, then who is? And especially being a first generation immigrant, being that person in my family who's moved across, and now the lineages are changing. The people that come after me, my children and my children's children, they will not be able to document my experience. Only I can do that. And so that's when I was like, I don't care if nobody reads this, and if they don't want to read it, I think it's important.
You're what's called an Insta Poet. You started on Instagram with these bite-sized nuggets of deeply personal expression, and then you self-published, and then the publishing world was forced to sit up and take notice, and you were and are a stupendous success. But is social media a vehicle, or does it define your form? In other words, obviously the length of your poem or your poetry is in some ways guided by this your generation, which doesn't have too big an attention span. But I'm curious to know whether the use of social media and Instagram defines your form for you, or is this your preferred form?
I think print for me is my preferred form. I think the reason I actually went to social media was because I started off as a performer, and so I would go on stage, and the longer pieces that you read in The Sun and Her Flowers, like Broken English, I was performing that. And then, you know, I tried to publish them online as like 4-piece poems, but they weren't translating. People were sort of missing the point. And so then I decided that I would just take little gems out of these very long poems. And then maybe if I just shared those, they would click in with my readers a little bit better. And that was working suddenly. And then I went from, you know, I had maybe 100 followers, and they were like my close family and friends and my neighbors, that sort of thing. And then I just felt like that just fits so well because we were able to have conversation and narrative about very direct topics. Yes. And that was fantastic. But so I think social media for me is very much a vehicle, just as the stage is another vehicle, which I think is my favorite place to perform and share my work.
But is it true that you don't have social media on your phone?
It is.
How did that happen?
This year I was locked away in a room writing The Sun and Her Flowers, and it was very difficult to do that because Milk and Honey was very organic in that by the time I decided that I was going to self-publish a book, the book was already done.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you start off and you're not from the industry and you think you're never going to be an author, there's no pressure. Yeah. But when I was writing The Sun and Her Flowers, I felt the pressure of now suddenly writing a book that had been on the New York Times bestseller list for however many weeks.
So performance anxiety.
Exactly. And then I felt like, oh my God, I have to, you know, impress my agent, impress all these publishers. Like, oh no, what am I going to do? And so I would write, and then other times I'd be just scrolling on my phone, just scrolling and seeing what everybody else is up to. And it made me feel so isolated. And it would just sort of cause so much anxiety in me. And that's when I was like, enough is enough. I need to delete this so I can focus on what's important. And that's writing this book.
So what did you delete first?
Instagram, of course. Yeah. That was probably the biggest distraction. So first it was Instagram, and then it was Twitter, and I just never went back.
And you never went back?
No. So there are times when I want to.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, but like, what is this person up to?
Take a sneak peek. So isn't it ironic? Because I mean, you're described as an Insta poet, and you really don't have Instagram on your phone anymore?
Yeah, and I think what it is that you just have to, there has to be a fine balance, and it's very difficult for somebody who, you know, uses social media and Instagram as one of the main places to share information. Yeah. How do you balance that? You know, how do you balance this virtual world with your real world? And sometimes you have to delete, sometimes, and it works.
You don't miss it?
Sometimes I do, but not really. It's so good to be in the present.
It is a kind of toxic addiction.
It is. I feel like, especially for me, now that I'm traveling and I'm doing all these things, it's already so difficult to stay present. And so social media and the internet in general adds another layer to that. But whenever we do post and we do share online, it is always me. I'm like, don't worry, everybody, I'm talking to you. I write everything, and then we post all of that.
So talking about Instagram, you know, you hit the headlines, and I have to say you had my attention when you did this post of, you know, fully clothed and you menstruating. Instagram takes it down.
Yes.
And you make this fantastic point, I thought, that, you know, you put a photo of me in my underwear, but you have a problem showing me menstruating. A small spot of blood is a problem. And of course, Instagram apologizes and puts it back on. But that is really a trigger point for the debate globally around menstruation. It's one that India is in the middle of. Why was it so important to you? I know why it was, but I think it's important for our viewers to understand this. Why was it so important for you to, it was almost like life installation to me, like it was art, right?
Yes.
But why was it important to you?
Yeah, so initially that started off as a school project, and it was so funny because what that project was actually came to life. So my professor said, you're supposed to pick a topic that's very taboo, and you're gonna talk about it, but you can't do it with words. And so I picked this because I'm so passionate about issues surrounding women. And I've struggled with menstruation so much in my life. And so I was like, I wanna work on this. And
have you ever faced in the community the usual kind of discrimination that women continue to go through? Don't touch the pickle jar, don't go to, you know, places of worship, oh, this is impure, oh, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
the sanitary pads wrapped up in sheets of black plastic. I always say the sanitary pads, I mean, in a country where sanitary pads are still called whisper, that exemplifies everything about our attitudes to menstruation.
I've never personally experienced that, but I know so many other women that have, and we've been having these conversations since middle school. I remember,
and this happens in Toronto as well.
Yes, so I remember when I first like learned about a period. I mean, and it's like certain people from not every community feels or experiences the same sort of, I guess, stories surrounding menstruation, but there are people that do. And so I remember when we learned about periods the first time, I was like, oh my God, is this a bad thing? Is it a good thing? I'm not sure, you know? And so, and that's why I think that photo raised so many questions globally,
yes.
because there was things that we could understand. I mean, in terms of certain communities being like, we're not supposed to talk about this. This is taboo. We want to keep it under the rug. But then there was other communities, like even in the West, that were like, but this is not an issue. Why are you talking about it? And I think that really showed me that no matter where in the world you come from, for some reason, no matter what lens you're looking through, it's still an issue everywhere, and that's why we need to talk about it. And I was so upset because this photo of me in pants, fully clothed, was removed, but then, you know, women started to come to me and send me, I had like dozens of emails coming through daily when that photo was removed, with women being like, I can't believe this is happening, because on Instagram, there's other websites, you know, pornography websites that have actually photos that are, you know, showcasing nude women, all of those things, and they're fully verified accounts with thousands and thousands of followers. The fact that those aren't taken down, but this photo that showcases our experience, maybe half of the world has, the fact that that's taken down is not okay. And that's why it went from being like a school project to a form of protest.
How did your own family react?
Really, at first I was scared.
Yeah.
I was like, oh no,
yeah.
I didn't tell my mom and dad I'm
yeah.
doing this. My dad was so funny. He's like, people care about this that much? This is an issue?
Yeah.
And then we just laughed. My mom was like, oh no, why are you always getting into these little things? My mom is like, she's always waiting for me to do something. And so luckily my family was very, very supportive. And my dad was like, this is a non-issue, come on. And more so he was worried about my safety going out, especially after.
And you were threatened, and you got a lot of abuse and trolling,
exactly.
right?
And so he was more so concerned about that and was making sure that, you know, I'm not alone when I go anywhere, all those things.
So, you know, you're a very, very important feminist voice for women and young women of your generation. You're a 20-somethings icon. That is almost like a burden of success, but also responsibility foisted on you maybe before you're ready for it. Do you now find that things you say, because you know that you're going to be followed, is there this kind of heaviness or anxiety that you shouldn't say the wrong thing, that what you say matters to other people? So you can't just be like a regular 25-year-old exploring the world?
For sure. I think I'm sort of shedding those things now, but for like the last 2 years, I was like, oh no, I can't let anyone down. I have to do this, I have to do that. I don't want to let anyone down.
What was the toughest thing?
I think the toughest thing was like, so there was a period where people started to get the poems tattooed on themselves. And then I was like, oh no, now you have my poem on your body.
That's scary.
Now I can't ever make a mistake. And that's so hard, because I think a part of being human is making mistakes. And so to navigate the world as like a 23-year-old telling herself, I can never make another mistake again, was difficult. But now I'm like, I just have to live my life and be the best that I can be, and it's okay.
So there's this very interesting, I feel, generation divide in the feminist conversation between millennials and women my age. And one of the things that we had a huge argument over in this country, and then I found it became a global argument, was period leave. And I don't know if you followed it, but in India there was actually a demand from certain young women for mandatory leave during your period.
Okay.
And it became like a huge talking point. I totally opposed it because I said it would ghettoize women, and it was a kind of biological determinism, and that our fight should be to call out the taboo, but not treat ourselves as somebody who, you know, who need time off in those 2 days. And I'm just curious how you see the place of a period in a woman's life, because here we are fighting for women to enter combat, to fly fighter jets, to be cops, to be whatever they want to be.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
What do you feel as a young feminist icon? I know, I've just,
I've
I've just done that
Yeah.
thing to you.
So
but
I mean, I've probably maybe for some reason I've never heard of
this debate, I'm
but,
glad, because I feel very strongly against it.
But I mean, I think I see it from a very nuanced perspective in that I think for sure we're always, you know, I'm on the fight for telling people we're, you know, men and women and everybody, we're equal the way that my counterparts, male counterparts are treated. That's how I want to be treated. And then, so I get it, you know, me saying that I want time off once a week, a month, then sort of
contradicts that.
Exactly.
Yes.
But then I also understand it from the other perspective. You know, the reason that I've struggled with menstruation so much in my life is because I have these
Awful cramps.
terrible, like, you know, even like up to the point where there's fainting spells and all of that. And so there are times when I remember going to work and not being able to work for 3 days in a row.
Which is what a lot of young women said to me.
Exactly.
You know, because I said, you know, I covered a war in 1999 and I had my period and I just popped a painkiller and they were like, maybe you did not go through debilitating pain.
Yes, and that's like some of my friends are like, oh, my period's never hurt in my life. And I was like, what does that even mean? Because I am like completely out for a week and everybody on my team knows I travel with a whole kit and like don't book me for interviews, don't book me for shows, because I don't know if I'm gonna be all right.
So you feel ambivalent about period leave?
I feel like there should be a point where like I'm able to, like I remember when I was working, this was a co-op job during my university years, and I would be so unwell with like pain due to like endometriosis and all that, and me having a conversation with my boss, like he just didn't get it. And so I feel like if we could work on that, where a young woman can go up to her boss and you can have conversation and you can listen and you can help each other understand, I think that's really important for that understanding to happen.
Do you find a generation divide in how, let's say, women who, you know, like I'm 46, you're 20, 25?
25.
25. So do you find that when you debate with older women that there is a difference in how you see the same issues? Another flashpoint for women that seem to, you know, where people got categorized almost along age lines was the Aziz Ansari episode, where almost all of us agree that he sounds absolutely odious and creepy. He's obviously tone deaf, is obviously insensitive, has no notion of, you know, he's rendering the woman he's with invisible. But there was a debate as to whether this was strictly a Me Too moment and whether it fell into the basket of sexual assault or not. And I'm just wondering where you weigh in as a young feminist icon.
I think that was a very interesting, I mean, the Me Too movement, the way that it was going, I think for that Aziz Ansari story to happen, that was a very interesting point in the movement, because whereas all the other stories were very clear cut and most of us were kind of on the same side with most of the stories and the cases coming out, this was the one that really made you do a lot of self-reflection, and it was really difficult. It was very complex and it was very nuanced, because it is not okay for a woman to feel violated in any way whatsoever. But I think that it was very important in that it opened up conversation and dialogue, and that was necessary.
So it confused you?
So it didn't confuse me, because it was like, I know when something is right and wrong. I've been writing about, these are the issues I've been writing about since I was like 12 years old, you know, performing and talking about sexual abuse. And most of Milk and Honey, I feel like, is about feeling like there is violence inflicted onto you when you're in a situation that you don't necessarily want to be in, and like understanding it is very difficult, you know, when you feel very powerless and you feel the need to be a certain way when there is a man around, and not being able to
socialize
say no.
to say yes when you want to say no.
Exactly. And so I think that it brought up a very important point. And for me, that story, what it pointed out was that we need more language. Like in all of the other cases, we could very much point out in terms of rape or sexual harassment or sexual assault. Whereas I felt like in this case, the language was a lot more tricky and the correct language was not utilized in talking about the stories, which what made it problematic for me. And so I think that if we could find the right language to describe exactly what happened in that room that day, that would help everybody moving forward.
I agree. And we need more words to talk about consent or the absence of consent.
Exactly. Because for me, I'm like, oh, you know, this is not right. But like, what is it then? And like, that's why we're all arguing, and that's why we're all confused.
But nomenclature matters, because one is criminal, the other is not. And I'm not suggesting that we have to be completely legalistic about it, but words matter. That's what feminists have devoted their lives to underline that words matter.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So we can't suddenly say, oh, words don't matter.
Exactly.
So that's an interesting point, that we do need more words. How difficult was it for you? Because diaspora communities often tend to be more conservative than the people they left back at home, right? I have noticed this with so many of my friends who migrated to the West. And when I travel and meet them, I find their societies in some ways much more conservative, like almost a decade behind what's happening for women here, at least in a certain class. How difficult was it for you to talk about sexual abuse, to break that silence, to lift that veil of silence, that shroud of silence, as I call it? And did you find that it opened the door for more women to come and say, yes, this happened to me too?
So I think I had a very interesting experience with that, because although I think it was difficult, I've just never been somebody who even takes in or accepts the difficulty of a situation, because when I'm passionate about something, I'm so passionate. And me talking about sexual violence that's inflicted on women's body is like something that I feel so strongly about. And so when I started doing it,
have you experienced it?
There have been times where
I
have. Exactly.
I mean,
and I write openly about that in Milk and Honey. And then I started opening up to the women around me, and this was like middle school. And then realizing that, I thought this was like this dirty little secret that just happened to me. But suddenly it happened to my best friend, it happened to her sister and her cousin, and then suddenly there's a room of us, and we were always talking about it. And then we went to high school, and then we were always talking about it. And so since like as long as I can remember, I've been around a group of women that are very open about these things. And so when I started writing and performing, it just was kind of easy and natural for me. And so actually I think as you talk about it more and more, and as you grow more and more, that's when it actually becomes difficult.
But do you find a kind of conservatism in your own community, which is displaced and yet not displaced? So there are two homes at least, right? There's Punjab, where your family came from. There's Toronto, which is now home. So one way of looking at it is neither is home. The other way of looking at it is that both are homes.
Yes.
Both come with their own sets of confusions and identity crises, right?
Exactly.
How has that been for you?
That has been, it's like walking on a tightrope, and you don't want to, fall on one side or the other. And I think the way I describe it is that it's like being an immigrant is like building a bridge from one land to the other, and you're kind of not here, not there. You're like right in the middle of that bridge. And that's what it's been like. It's like a nice little dance that you have to do between the house that you live in with your parents at home, and then, when you go to school, it's a completely different environment. So you I feel like for a while I was almost like leading two different lives, and only now am I able to take those two lives and be like, hey, now I deserve to just be me in all the spaces, and you're gonna accept that.
You've had your share of critics panning you for being too simple, right? For being too obvious. And one of the things that you have made an interesting point about is that you did not actually come to writing speaking English always as your first language.
Yes.
And there were many people you knew for whom that was the case, right? So talk a little bit about that part of your past that I know while I was researching for this interview, I found very little on that. Talk about that time when you couldn't speak English, when maybe you were mocked for not being able to speak English, when you felt displaced because of the lack of that language and the lack of access, and why therefore access to words and mass access to words actually becomes a deeply political statement to make.
Exactly. So when I I started school probably at the age of 5, but because I did my early schooling in India and then moved to Canada when I was 4, I had no introduction to English.
You couldn't speak it at all?
No, my parents didn't speak it, so it's not like even when we were living in Canada in the early years, it's not like, they were speaking it in the house. The first time I remember going to kindergarten, and I had 3 younger siblings, so of course, not like they were going to teach me. I was supposed to be teaching them. But I remember going to kindergarten. I'm surrounded by like 25 kids yapping away in English. I'm surrounded by 2 teachers giving directions and me feeling like I was from another planet. I felt like an alien in that room and terrified because, you know, I'd been in a home where I'm able to communicate my wants and have conversation, and suddenly I'm stuck in this room every single day where I have no idea what's going on, and that made me feel very, very voiceless. And because of that, there was years where I just didn't even speak out loud. And I remember in grade 5 then, you know, I made a friend of mine who was like my best friend, and I would chat with her, but it put me in a position where I was made to feel like I shouldn't be speaking, or I was a very shy person. And so that was the sort of persona I took on. I'm a shy person who doesn't speak.
So the lack of access to that language made you not express yourself.
Exactly.
Made you scared, made you feel you didn't belong. So when you finally do acquire the skills of English, was it almost deliberately important to you to speak a language that was accessible to people like you and other people who may not typically be readers of books?
Exactly. Well, the way I sort of fell in love or sort of embraced the English language was by first being a reader. I fell in love with books. It was like 3rd grade, and my teacher was fantastic. So she gave an award weekly to the kid who read the most books. And I was such a nerd, of course. I won the award like every single week. I would read dozens and dozens and dozens of books because I couldn't really communicate with people. You know, I wasn't speaking, I wasn't making friends, so books were my friends. So that's when the love affair with books sort of began. And it was so incredible then to turn to writing because I could face that fear head on. The thing that had sort of been looming over me for so long, suddenly I was able to face it and be like, no, like I own you. And so that was incredible. And then even after that, you know, I love writing in English, and now finally having the words, and very specific words. Words for me are so important, and especially very specific words with my poetry. There was a moment where I struggled with the fact that suddenly I'm writing in English. You know, shouldn't I be writing in my mother tongue? You know, there's so few poets writing in Punjabi.
But you do use the punctuation of Gurmukhi. Your line breaks are actually
and that's why I brought that in.
The punctuation from Gurmukhi.
Yes. Right? Because then...
Can you explain, I mean, I'm Punjabi, so I get that. Can you explain that to people who don't know?
So then, I guess I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah.
So I was feeling so guilty because I'm like, I should be able to write in Punjabi because I can read it, I can speak, and I can write it. So then I started to write poetry in it, and it was really bad. And so then I was like, all right, maybe I should stick with English. But then I was like, wait a minute. I'm also like a blending of 2 different worlds, you know? I feel like I'm not East, I'm not West, I'm right in the middle. Why can't my English be like that? Especially if, you know, my English has been like that for so long. And so I thought maybe there's some characteristics in my language that I can bring over to English. And so I thought about it, and I realized that Gurmukhi, the script that Punjabi is written in, doesn't have any case distinction, so no uppercase, no lowercase, and they only use periods. And so it was my fancy little way of sort of breaking in the English and sort of marrying those 2 worlds.
And it's interesting because most people won't know that unless they were familiar with the script, right? Or
exactly.
unless you told them. Now, 2.5 million copies in your first book of poems and counting is a lot of success. You suddenly become this global, not suddenly, with your book's success you become a global sensation. For women especially, being successful comes with its share of backlash. You're suddenly put under the microscope, all kinds of things are said about you. You've had your share of that, you've had your poetry mocked, you've been criticized, you've had writers in the same space saying, hey, but that was my idea, you took it away, you've had all of that, right? But you're young. Right? If people forget that success came to you. I mean, I have to remind my viewers you're 25 years old, right? How does somebody like you deal with that kind of scrutiny?
It's hard. I can't sit across from you and lie to you and tell you it's easy. It is hard, but I think, I mean, within that house that I was raised in, it not only provided me with like the passion and determination to write those books at such an early age, but even, you know, to deal with that sort of criticism with my head held strongly and my feet on the ground and just focus on the goals ahead, you know, because it's not about for me, it's not about what's being said and talked about in this moment. You know, I'm here and I want to write and I want to share for an entire lifetime. And
do you have the instinct to argue back with people on social media? I used to do that a lot till I learned not to do it.
I used to do that when I first started. Oh my God, I was like, yeah, like, let's go. Everybody make a Twitter account. Let's talk to these people. And I realized, wait, these people are not here to talk though. You know, and that's the thing, like, you can't personalize it.
Yes.
And once I started to realize that the most incredible human beings on the planet have haters,
yes,
then I was like, oh, I don't need to worry about this.
Now, here's an ironic dimension to your life. One of your poems, and one of your most successful poems, is an apology to women for first describing them as pretty instead of taking other characteristics of their personality or their achievement. But in many ways, the way you have been deconstructed has also been about how you look, how you're styled, how the package is good, right? These are ironies that women deal with. How do you deal with this irony? Because your most successful poem is an apology to referencing women as pretty above other things, and then you may find that exactly that happens to you.
Like, sorry, what happened?
Like referencing you as, oh, this beautiful looking woman from Toronto who wears whatever, right? So what you don't want to happen to other women could happen to you as a public figure. So how do you cope with that?
So actually, the reason that poem, or let's talk about why I wrote that poem. So it was a couple of years ago. So growing up, and this was throughout high school and university, I've had like friends that are like supermodel high and just all of those things. And so I was always like kind of the odd one out, you know? And so I was thinking about one day, you know, when I meet people and, you know, I enter a setting, like a social setting, whether it's like a dinner or a party, for some reason, the compliment that I crave the most, like somebody could say, oh my goodness, Rupi, you're like the most intelligent human being on earth, or you're this and you're that. For some reason, at that point, those things didn't matter. What I was most hungry for some reason, was, oh, you're so pretty, you're so beautiful. And
you were hungry for it.
Yes, I was. For some reason, I put more value in that than anything else because I felt like I wasn't receiving that. And so, and also at the same time, it was also the first compliment I gave to every woman that I met. It wasn't that, oh, hey, like the last book that you wrote was so incredible. It was, oh my goodness, you look amazing. I love your handbag. I love this and that. And I was like, oh, like I kind of want to tell myself and let myself know that that's not what I should be craving the most. And perhaps in order to change that, maybe that's not the first compliment that I want to be.
And do people do that to you? Is that the first compliment you get?
No.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah. The first compliment is usually, oh my goodness, you write so great, or
thank
this
God.
And that.
Like, I mean, I think today you'd feel terrible if the first compliment was anything else but about your work.
I would.
Yeah,
I'd
and
be
that's
like,
what I keep telling.
I would carry the books around with me and just like hand them out for free at that point. I'm like, you need to read this.
So I want to ask you, you come from Canada.
Yes.
It is seen to be today to be among the most feminist governments in the world because it's 50% women. Trudeau's always talking about being a feminist man. Do you feel like that as a Canadian? Do you because from the outside, from afar, like we keep saying, wow,
yeah.
Trudeau.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it actually, does it feel like, wow, Trudeau too?
I mean, with the new government coming in, it did feel like a great and refreshing sort of change. And
especially when your neighbor is Trump.
Yes, of course. And so it's felt like that even more since, of course. I think that we're headed in a great direction. I think there's always room for more conversation. And I think the government does open doors to have that conversation. And I think it's our job as the writers and the artists to push them even more. And so that's what I hope to do in the coming years.
In the end, and I'm going to ask you to read one of your poems, but in the end, what has been the toughest thing about being brown and Sikh growing up in Canada?
I think not being understood in terms of what those things mean. I feel like being Sikh and being brown, like they come with so much dialogue and so much history that when you walk into a room, the fact that nobody can see that and they just see this and their stereotypes of that, that's been difficult. And that's why, it's so important for me to talk about my background.
But you haven't disowned your language, for example. You do still speak Punjabi.
Oh my God, yes.
Most of us can't, we speak it in a clumsy way. Do you speak it comfortably?
I speak comfortably. I mean, it's for sure not perfect.
Can you say something to us in Punjabi?
मैं की कमा?
कुछ भी.
Okay. ਮੈਨੂੰ ਬਹੁਤ ਵਧੀਆ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਇੱਥੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ.
Thank you. So when you say you didn't want those stereotypes, what was the one stereotype you spent a lot of your life escaping?
Ooh. The one that was like brown people are very hairy, because you know what, I was
you're
Sikh.
Your
hair was up to
is
here.
pink.
I had a
Yes.
gigantic braid, and like lots of eyebrow hair, all of those things. And growing up in a Sikh household where hair removal doesn't exist for generations and generations, like your ancestors weren't waxing and shaving, you know, and then suddenly having to figure all of that out in a country where hair is not beautiful and not feminine, that was probably the thing that comes to mind.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to end with asking you to do one of your poems. You can, I think the second book, maybe on the one on the migrants. I mean, that would be good. The immigrants.
Okay. Perhaps we are all immigrants, trading one home for another. First, we leave the womb for air. Then, the suburbs for the filthy city in search of a better life. Some of us just happen to leave entire countries.
Rupi Kaur, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Have a good stay in India, and I hope you make it back to Punjab.
I will. Thank you so much.